So-called fact-checkers have received significant criticism recently. Prominent examples abounded during the Voice referendum. This culminated in controversy surrounding RMIT's FactLab. It was accused of biased, one-sided, and inaccurate fact checks. It was also accused of purporting to fact-check while certification with the International Fact-Checking Network had lapsed. Meta had suspended its partnership with the FactLab as a result. However, now it seems that certification has been reinstated, and the partnership seems set to resume. The Australian quotes a Meta spokesperson as stating, "Following its review, the International Fact-Checking Network has recertified RMIT FactLab as a third-party fact-checker and an active signatory of the IFCN Code of Principles. Given this decision, Meta will reinstate RMIT FactLab as a third-party fact-checking program, pending completion of our partner onboarding process." RMIT also opined on this, stating, "RMIT is pleased to confirm that the FactLab signatory status with the IFCM has been formally renewed. FactLab has always maintained a rigorous standard to ensure the accuracy of its work, including ongoing compliance with the IFCN's Code of Principles. However, there are some problems, and not everyone is actually impressed with this, or in fact actually believes what RMIT FactLab is saying. For example, Sky News was not particularly impressed." The Australian quotes a Sky News spokesperson as stating, "RMIT FactLab's staff have publicly campaigned on issues they have fact-checked and have sought to censor political views they do not agree with unduly focusing their fact-checks on only one side of a debate. Both are breaches of the IFCN's published principles designed to promote impartiality. The fact-checking service also has a track record of publishing inaccurate fact-checks and deleting them with no acknowledgement of the correction. Another clear breach of the IFCN's published principles, which demand transparency from its members through an open and honest corrections process." So here we can see a bit of a war of words. Sky News clearly does not like FactLab, and FactLab seemingly doesn't actually like Sky News or what Sky News is campaigning for, which itself is a bit of a problem because if there's bias in the fact checks, well, they're possibly not even actually fact checks to begin with. This overall is a major concern. Now, I have several misgivings about FactLab and its involvement in many political aspects, in particular in The Voice, which it seemed to actively support. In my opinion, FactLab was indeed biased in some areas. Unfortunately, however, under the government's proposed misinformation law, such bodies like the FactLab would receive yet more power, as they would presumably be tasked with attempting to reduce so-called misinformation under that legislation. This, of course, is an issue because then you've got biased fact-checkers going around promoting government talking points, or at least promoting progressive government talking points. To my mind, the FactLab requires major reforms to ensure public confidence with its actions. This in fact coheres with what Justice Michael Kirby, one of the most progressive High Court judges, had stated on judicial impartiality. He stated, "Judicial impartiality is one of the core values of being a judge. I think Australia has a healthy degree of skepticism about the authority and is watchful of issues like this." Indeed, one might also wonder whether this applies to fact-checkers. Australians might have a healthy degree of skepticism about fact-checkers and whether or not they're actually doing their job properly. Fact-checking the fact-checkers is therefore desirable and essential. This was abundantly clear during the Voice referendum. The RMIT FactLab's personnel clearly supported the Voice given their own social media posts, which were many and clearly on the one side. They are, of course, entitled to their beliefs, and it is better that they are public with their beliefs than they bury them, because if those beliefs are public, we can then scrutinize the accuracy and veracity of their fact checks. So I don't necessarily begrudge the social media posts. However, I do begrudge only one side of the debate actually getting involved in the fact checks, leading to potentially one-sided and biased decisions. Fact checkers, for example, would erroneously fact-check the No campaign, but would ignore mistruths from the Yes campaign. In so doing, bodies like the RMIT FactLab would appear to clearly violate the IFCM's own guidelines for fact-checkers. It would also create a narrative that the No campaign was peddling mistruths, but by only fact-checking one side, you were simply cherry-picking data to try to make a point. Selective cherry-picking of data is misleading. It creates a narrative, and that narrative is not necessarily accurate, because it ignores the mistruths on the other side of the debate. Biased and one-sided fact-checkers are clearly misleading, because they create a false narrative. The fact-checkers here need to be fact-checked. And we can see this with just a few examples. RMIT FactLab, for example, claimed that Peter Credlin's assertion that the Uluru Statement was more than one page was false. However, Peter Credlin was either correct literally or by implication, And ABC's Media Watch itself actually weighed in on the side of Sky News and Peter Credlin in this basis. There was, of course, a longer background version of the Uluru Statement, which was called the Uluru Statement. Indeed, Uluru Dialogue co-chair Megan Davis, who campaigned for The Voice, had at one point actually stated the Uluru Statement was more than one page, before backtracking seemingly to try to support Anthony Albanese and the Voice campaign.
A very powerful part of the Uluru Statement from the Heart is that it isn't just the first, one-page statement. It's actually a very lengthy document of about 18 to 20 pages. It's very important for Australians to read the statement. And the statement is also much bigger. It's actually 18 pages.
She had stated it was more than one page herself. Therefore, you would think that at least the length of the Uluru Statement was disputed. But even if the Uluru Statement was literally just one page, the words on that page are vague and require definition. It is therefore disingenuous to claim that the words giving that definition are not part of the underlying one-page statement. That is, the definition is important to what is going on in that one-page Uluru Statement. Therefore, the fact-check was clearly inaccurate. The RMIT FactLab also erroneously fact-checked claims about how many Indigenous Australians supported The Voice. A small TikToker had argued that the original poll, which claimed that 80% of Indigenous Australians supported The Voice, was misleading.
The majority of my people have not been consulted in regard to this voice to Parliament.
The video continues on, and it has some expletives in it, so I won't play the whole thing. But in essence, the video basically argued that Indigenous Australians hadn't been consulted about The Voice, or at least the majority had not been. Rather, potentially it had been a small number of people at the Uluru Dialogues, however it was not the majority of Indigenous Australians. And therefore it was erroneous to claim that 80% of Indigenous Australians supported The Voice, because that number simply hadn't been tested. And indeed we can see some merit in this argument. After all, even when there was polling that suggested 80% of Indigenous Australians supported The Voice, that polling was actually quite stale. And since that time period, support for The Voice had actually declined significantly. Furthermore, polling Indigenous Australians is notoriously rather difficult given low response rates and given the heterogeneity of thoughts across multiple locations. And therefore, it was going to be very difficult to get accurate polling. Not only that, the sample size behind that 80% poll figure was incredibly low, meaning the poll simply wasn't statistically rigorous to begin with. In essence, there were some very valid points underlying what this TikTok video was saying. However, RMIT FactLab slapped a fact check on it anyway. Therefore, the FactLab was simply wrong. They deleted their fact check, however, they didn't actually give an explanation for why they deleted it or a correction of the record. By contrast, the FactLab simply failed to fact check falsehoods from the Yes campaign. This includes claims that The Voice would only speak to matters that differently affect Indigenous Australians, as Mark Dreyfus had wrongly asserted in his second reading speech, when in fact the amendment text would have enabled The Voice to speak to any matter, something that Megan Davis had explicitly stated. They also include the Uluru Dialogue's claims that The Voice would be elected and have equal gender representation, even though there was no basis for this, as the government had refused to produce the legislation underpinning The Voice. They include misleading claims that The Voice would be merely advisory, when in fact it would have clear implicit power due to the fact that it could control the narrative, because it would have been the only constitutionally enshrined body that would have had representation rights and consultation rights and the abundant right to litigate vexatiously in order to obtain collateral goals, which would therefore give rise to power. FactLab simply didn't fact-check all of those issues that came up, but it only fact-checked the no side of the campaign. This created a biased and misleading narrative. The FactLab needs significant reforms for people to actually trust what it is doing. Now clearly there are resource constraints. The FactLab might not be able to fact-check everything from every side of the debate. However, if you are going to hold yourself out as a fact-checker with a certification, you have to be able to make sure you've got those resources. If you don't have those resources, don't pretend to be a fact-checker. In that case, you are just yet another commentator, and the FactLab really shouldn't hold itself out to be fact-checking if it doesn't have the resources to do it properly. And therefore, there are significant concerns about whether fact-checkers are themselves accurate. This is obviously a major problem, and it's a problem that will only get worse if the government's misinformation bill actually makes it into legislation. And therefore that misinformation bill is something we really need to try to defeat, because it would enable the government to go around spreading misinformation, because the government's own misinformation wouldn't fall within the legislation, but would crack down on other individuals, enabling fact-checkers to go and rule the narrative, presumably in a progressive manner with which the government happened to agree with. The misinformation bill is clearly an egregious attack on free speech, and something that needs to be resisted entirely. And clearly people can resist the misinformation bill in many ways. It can include writing to newspapers, writing to local members, doing social media posts about it. There are myriad things one can do to try to strike back against the misinformation bill. Those actions might not necessarily be effective, but they're certainly better than doing nothing and just being steamrolled. But in any case, if you've got any thoughts about the RMIT FactLab and its ability to now fact check yet again, well, let me know that in the comments below. And otherwise, thanks a lot for tuning in. Don't forget to subscribe, and hopefully I'll see you next time as well.